Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Do you know anybody who takes a lot of chances? I mean, somebody who does something that, if they slip, fall, or otherwise fail, their life will almost certainly be over? Well, today we're going to hear about the remarkable life of a man from a bygone era, the era of daredevils. He was a top-rated aeronaut, and that's a person who travels or works in a hot air balloon. But trust me, it's not the sophisticated and safe hot air balloons you're thinking of. Our guest today is Tim Jacobs. He's author of the book, The Life of J.J. Fanning. Tim has some absolutely spellbinding stories to share with us, and I'll tell you, there's a bit of a surprise at the end. Tim's going to be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question. The question is, something happened to the infamous French military leader Rochambeau, the guy who teamed up with George Washington to win the Revolutionary War, when he camped in Yorktown, New York, and it made Washington livid. What was it? Well, stay tuned after the main program for the answer. It'll give you the topic for next week's show. I've always kind of liked the term calculated risk. Those are the kinds of risks you can take so long as they add up on your side of the ledger at the end. I generally try to avoid risks that don't give me a pretty decent chance of emerging from an action at least as good as when I started. Well, I wouldn't make a good aeronaut, or at least I wouldn't have back in the early 1900s. I've been in a modern hot air balloon, but the type we're going to be talking about today, it's not the type that the Wizard of Oz casually flew off in. If you're thinking about that, just wait until you hear. Our guest today, author Tim Jacobs. He's published a book on Connecticut native J.J. Fanning, who made his living as an aeronaut, doing daredevil stunts, the likes of which, well, you simply won't believe it until you hear Tim tell them. Tim says that J.J. made the equivalent of $5,000 a week more than 100 years ago, no taxes or Social Security withheld. Social Security didn't even exist back then. Still, when you hear what J.J. did for that money, you might even think he was underpaid. Now, at the end of the interview, I got a little surprise from Tim, and I'll let you wait and hear about that as well. So, Tim, when we talk about a guy like J.J. Fanning, we're really going back to a bygone era where there were what I call daredevils, people who did just really outrageous stunts for a living. They made their money that way. And tell me a little bit about J.J. Fanning's background. Where was he born? Tell me a little bit about him.
J.J. Fanning, which actually his name was John Jack Fanning, but he went by J.J. He was born in 1882 in West Haven, Connecticut, on his parents' farm. He was the first of 5 children. He either A, had a family dispute because he didn't want to do farming. Back in the 1890s, you did what your father did for a business. There was really no question about it. It was either the dispute and he just kind of ran away from home, or it was just he didn't want to farm and he just told his parents, I'm going to go strike out on my own. And around 1900 to 1906, he was actually a tumbler and a trapeze artist in the circus. Back then, I mean, you're not tethered to anything. There's no OSHA regulations. There's no safety nets. And sure enough, he slipped and fell and he broke his hip and broke his wrist and couldn't do that work anymore.
So what did he decide to do? He did a little bit of a pivot in his career, didn't he?
He ended up in New York and he met a gentleman by the name of Edwin Hutchinson, who was an aeronaut. An aeronaut back then was, you went up in a hot air balloon. And I don't mean like, a wicker basket and a burner and a pilot like we do today if you went in a hot air balloon. But he basically sat on a canvas strap. I always tell people, if you've ever been parasailing before, it's the same thing. You're just sitting on that strap and you're going up in the air. And then at these state fairs and outdoor vaudeville shows, carnivals, a signalman would fire the gun and he would just let go of the balloon. When the signalman fired the gun, he would just let go of the balloon and jump off, pulls a parachute, reaches over his head, grabs all the cords to the chute, has a machete on his outfit that he would pull out, slice it over his head. That parachute flies off. Now he's free falling. So he pulls a different cord Out comes another parachute. So this is one single drop, but he would use anywhere from 3 to 5 parachutes. His record was 12 drops on one performance. It would kind of be the equivalent today where if, you jump out of the plane and you pull your parachute and there's some malfunction, you could like disengage that parachute, you pull your emergency cord, out comes another parachute. Well, he was doing something like that, except he was doing probably, like I say, 3 to 5, and his record was doing 12 on one single descent.
And in those years, parachuting was pretty early on in terms of the technology. That was pretty risky.
Definitely risky. I mean, I found a lot of articles of, he got hung up in the power wires. He landed in a pond. He landed on rocks. There's really no way to steer all that when you're coming down.
Wow. Now, he also, as I heard it, in, I guess, 1905, 1906, somewhere around there, he was at Luna Park in Hartford and decided, I don't know if it was around the 4th of July, but decided to add some pyro to his fall, right?
Yeah, some pyrotechnics of the day, I guess. The article that I found said that he had strapped 100 bottle rockets and 100 Roman candles all over his outfit and tied all the wicks together. And as he's going up on the balloon just before his jump, he was able to light that. And then so on his way down, and I'm guessing this is obviously, this was done probably in the evening. So here you would see this parachute pop open, all these fireworks going off, the Roman candles shooting out their colored balls of fire. And then he'd cut the chute and free fall, all these fireworks going off, and then another parachute would pop open. And he was doing his drops while all these fireworks are shooting off from him.
And not to mention, of course, the risk of the fireworks going into the parachute and catching it on fire, too. So, I mean, all sorts of risks around you. Now, I've been up in a hot air balloon. I've been up in the kind that have a wicker basket, and I only went once, but it was a miraculous trip, and it was great fun, and it is a scary thing. What amazes me about this guy, though, I mean, I think I was maybe 2,000 feet off the ground, and you could still actually talk to people on the ground because there's no noise other than when you have to turn the burner on a little bit to get some more heat to put the balloon higher in the air. But otherwise, you're just floating along in the wind, and you can actually have conversations with people on the ground. It's unbelievable. But this time, he went up 10,000 feet, becoming the highest flyer on Earth. I mean, 11,500 feet is timberline, where you start to run out of oxygen. That's a phenomenal distance.
Yeah, and he had just started doing these performances in 1906. So my calculation is he got hurt in the circus in 1905. And then in 1906, he met Hutchinson and started to do these performances. And then in 1907, he definitely set a record of the first person to like free fall jump from just over 10,000 feet.
There's another one from, I guess, 1908, where he did something called the human bomb stunt. What was that all about?
That was him and the other fellow, Hutchinson. Now, Hutchinson was the guy, he was in charge of probably like half a dozen men who were balloonists or aeronauts doing these stunts. And what he did was he had taken a couple crates, dismantled them, and rebuilt it so it was kind of like the shape of an egg. So you have this large wooden egg. This is something Hutchinson did himself, and then J.J. Fanning started to do it, where he would climb in this egg, and then they would nail them all in there. In the narrower part of the oval, they actually had dynamite. And then there was a wick that went to JJ, and he's curled up at the other end of this wooden egg. They would tie a couple parachutes to it. It would go up. When he'd hear the signal gun, he lit the wick. The dynamite would blow, and it would send him one way while sending basically all this shrapnel of the wooden bomb, they call it, down to the ground, which I'm sure was so safe for all the spectators below. But this thing would just explode. And once JJ got his bearings back, he would then start to do his parachute drop.
Wow. So now, I mean, I did the risk of that is just hard to even fathom. Now, when you talk about a guy like J.J. Fanning, what first comes to mind to me, at least, is a guy like Evel Knievel when I was growing up in the 1970s. here's a guy who would take his motorcycle and do these outrageous stunts, and again, he'd get paid for it. And I guess the best one he ever did was he jumped 14 Greyhound buses in the 1970s. That was the longest one. And the risk you run always, of course, is that it's just not going to work. And I guess in 1912, the luck ran out for J.J. Fanning. Tell us what happened at the Newark Valley Fairgrounds.
It's the summer. It's August 8th, as you said, 1912, and he's performing. And many of the articles had said he was acting oddly. I don't know exactly what they mean by he was acting oddly, but what happened was it was raining that day, and they called the jumps off. About 3 hours later, the rain had cleared out, the wind had died down, so Hutchinson came back into their tent where the balloonists were probably just, I assume they're just hanging out playing cards with nothing to do. Says, hey, the jumps are on. He said, Fanning, you're up first. He went over to where his balloon was now basically, I don't want to say inflated, but what they would do is they would actually hold the balloon over some open fires to capture all the heat. And then once the balloon was really ready to go and take off, he would clip it onto his uniform, and that's what would take him up. As he's going up, I figured this is announced over the PA. The crowd comes, they watch him gear up, they watch him as he starts to rise. He's shouting to the crowd, you'll win, you'll win. And he also had a handful of playbills, like you would kind of get like a program telling you where everything is. This is where the livestock is, the games, the food. He was just throwing handfuls of the playbills down to the people below. The other thing was he refused to let Hutchinson examine his equipment, which is something Hutchinson did for all of his performers every single time without fail. He was the last one to look at your equipment before you went up, and JJ refused to let him near his equipment. So he goes up, the gun goes off, he lets go of his chute, he starts his drop, he pulls out his parachute, and I'm thinking, when you're underneath your parachute and you look up, all you see is your parachute. And he grabbed the cords and did his usual routine. He took out a machete, he cut the cords, and then you could see, or at least he could see, the people down below probably already seen it, but all four of his parachutes deployed at once. And then when he cut the cords to what he thought was the one parachute, he didn't realize all four of them. So he released all four parachutes. So he was no longer attached to a parachute. He just free fell from there. Of course, he lands, he's unconscious. Then he starts to wake up a bit. They bring him back to the balloonist tent. They said, we need to make him more comfortable. So they took him across the street to a farmhouse. And it was in there they sent to get other doctors to come look at him. The farmer's daughter, who was basically taking care of him, said he was just talking gibberish, couldn't understand him. And his last words were, my father is William Fanning, my mother's Julia Hayes. They live in West Haven, Connecticut. And then he died there at that house. And then his father sent two of his nephews down to pick him up. And, this is 1912. So he sent them with a couple horses and a wagon. And to go from West Haven, to Newark Valley, New York, that's about 4.5 hours in a car today with interstates. So back then, this was probably an all-day trip for them to get there, retrieve John's body, and then, a good day of traveling to get back to West Haven. And they buried him in the family plot at the St. Lawrence Cemetery in West Haven.
Now, there's this unbelievable picture of this tragic accident that you came upon. And if you could just share the story of how you happened to come into possession of this photo.
I can tell you, when I started this adventure some years and years ago of researching his life, I didn't find out about him until I was in my young 30s, and I'm 57 now. I had wrote to the Tioga County of New York Historical Society, letting them know that this guy is my great-great uncle. He died there performing, curious what information you might have, etc. And one of the volunteers there, she wrote me back saying, this is the most interesting request we've ever gotten. I'm going to be your go-to person. You just email me, let me know what you want, and I'll find it for you. So one of my emails along the way was, can you go to the town hall and get his death certificate? I'm just curious to see what that says. This lady goes there, requests his death certificate, and the woman there gets it, fills it out, and hands it to her. And she's like, "Can I ask, why are you asking for this gentleman's death certificate?" So she told her about me, about what I'm doing. And the lady goes, "Hold on, I have something for you." She goes back into the hall, and that picture is hanging up on the wall at the clerk's office in the town hall. And she took it off the wall, gave it to this lady, said, "Go make a copy and send it to this guy. He'll probably like that." And that's how I got that picture.
You didn't mention this before. He was your great-great-uncle?
He was my great-great-uncle. I mean, this guy was a celebrity during his time because anywhere he went to perform once he got with Hutchinson, he was on the front page of the newspaper, that he was coming, and then a day or two or a week later, he's on the front page again of was his performance, and someone wrote a review about it.
28 newspapers carried the story of JJ's fatal crash in 1912 from New York City to locations all across the country. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. You know, when Tim Jacobs was doing genealogical studies of his family, one of his grandparents said, "There's one family, everybody thinks they only had 4 children, but they had a 5th. His name was John. That's all that Tim needed. He found out about his great-great-uncle J.J. Fanning, and it turns out nobody else in his family from this generation knew anything about him at all. Well, now we all do. I want to thank Tim for being our guest today and his book, The Life of J.J. Fanning. The answer to this week's trivia question: something happened to the infamous French military leader Rochambeau, the guy who teamed up with George Washington to help us win the Revolutionary War, when he camped in Yorktown, New York, and it made Washington livid. What was it? Well, it turns out Rochambeau was arrested by a local sheriff. Next week on Amazing Tales, really one of the most unbelievable stories you'll ever hear about the Revolutionary War, or any military campaign for that matter. We're going to have the story of how and why Rochambeau was arrested. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.